Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today I want to do a video that I've been thinking about doing for a while, and that's going to be ranking all 16 of the modern USFL teams. The USFL has been around for 2 years now in the modern sense, so what better way to look at the league than just ranking all 16 teams? This will be done by both comparing them within their year and year to year. The easiest way is to just get started. Now, coming in at number 16 is the 2022 Maulers. This is not a shock to anyone, I don't think. This team was horrifically bad. This is probably the worst spring football team across any team dating back to the AAF. This team was horrific. Look, that picture at the top right is what they're most famous for. It's when Devion Smith got cut because he wanted to eat pizza instead of chicken salad. Kirby Wilson just was a terrible coach. The team's only win was a literal last second win with zero time on the clock against a team that blew more halftime leads than the Falcons. They had the worst record across both seasons at 1-9. They had the worst point differential across both seasons at minus 96, which was 52 points worse than the second to worst team in the 23 Panthers. They were tied for worst at points allowed in the 2022 season with 222 with the Panthers. And they were second to worst in yards, passing, and rushing in 22. The only team worse was the Gamblers in all three. This team was most remembered probably, though, for the four horrid quarterbacks they had as well as the Pizzagate. Vadley was their best quarterback by a mile, really, and he wasn't even really that good, technically. He just, felt like the best of all of them. Loletta, Rivers, Love, none of them really this was a horrid team. And in their Week 10 game for the rights to the number one overall pick, the winner got that pick, and they got absolutely trounced. Even though the final score says it was a 12-point game, like 16 points the Maulers scored were literally in the last quarter. It was a blowout. The number 15 is going to be the 22 Panthers. This should be pretty obvious considering the fact that the only team the Panthers beat this year were the Maulers, the worst team in the whole, modern USFL. They were tied for worst at points allowed at, 222, as I said before. And their minus 6 turnover differential was second to worst in the 22 season. And then they were second in yards, which is good, third in rushing, and first in passing, believe it or not. And they did lose a lot of one-score games, which is the main reason why I think that they debatably could be higher. But I think that all in all, when you look at this team, there's a lot of, poor coaching decisions. There was that horrid time where, Fisher decided to kick a field goal rather than use one more run play and ended up costing him. I did a whole in-depth review about that video. And their quarterback room was arguably even worse than the Maulers. Look, the Panthers look better by volume-wise, but when you look at passer rating, Lynch was really the best quarterback on this roster, and that's because he had one really good game in Week 10. This team was also pretty bad. I think it's pretty safe to say that these are the two worst teams. So, yeah. Now, coming in at number 14 is the worst team from the 23 season, and that's going to be the New Jersey Generals. Look, they did have 5 All-USFL players, which, looking back, is pretty insane. But yeah, they were the worst team, and I don't really think it was that close from this season. The fact is that if you forget about their, last-ditch effort to make the playoffs in Week 9, where they beat the Stars, the last, 6 games of the season, they were absolutely terrible. Look, they had the worst record in the year. They had tied for the worst turnover differential at -4 for the season. While they may have been third in yards and first in rushing, their seventh in passing really hurt them, and the big issue was that DeAndre Johnson just fell off completely. Without the help of, Luis Perez as your second great quarterback, DeAndre ended up being basically the full-time starter for half the year, playing the entire games, and yikes. While I did technically have more yards per game, when you look at his average yards per pass, they went down by 3. He, threw the same amount of interceptions, which you wouldn't like to see, but mainly his completion percentage and passer rating both fell off cliffs. He also took more sacks. He just was a lot worse. This team, the numbers don't show him being that bad, but I think everyone looks back at this season and says that this team, for a good chunk of it, really was not that good. Now, coming in at number 13 is going to be the 22 Bandits. The Bandits, looking back, I think deserve to be where they are. When I did this, I did not look at either of my power rankings for the 22 season or the 23 season. I wanted to look back truly unobjectively or just objectively at who was the worst. And this team I have as being worse than the Gamblers who finished below them. The reason is that the only teams they beat were, the Maulers, Panthers, and Gamblers. They didn't even sweep the Gamblers. They just beat them once. Then you look at their two all USFL players, Jerron Jones and Brandon Wright, are good, but they had the worst turnover differential across both seasons at -10, which is horrid. And they were sixth in yards, sixth in rushing, and fifth in passing in the 22 season. And their rushing group was, eh. Looking back, I don't think it's as bad as I remember it being, but it's still not good. Juwan Washington and BJ Emmons were your two, best running backs, and they weren't as good as Te'amu. But yeah, I think this team deserves to be here. They lost their chance to make the playoffs in week 9, and they got crushed by the Breakers. And the fact that they are so bad in some key stats, and the fact they have a far worse point differential than the Gamblers, is they're like 30 to the Gamblers 10. I think this team deserves to be the 13th team in the list. Now, coming in at number 12 is going to be another 23 team in the 23 stars. This team might be shocking that it's this low. It might not. But yeah, I'm putting them this low. Look, they lost their Week 10 game against the Panthers to miss the playoffs, and they lost the game by being shut out in the second half, and they lost to a guy who literally was signed like 2 weeks prior in E.J. Perry. They did have two All-USFL players in really talented receiver Corey Coleman, and a guy who literally won a game for them by himself, Luis Aguilar. But their worst points allowed across both seasons at 242. They're 12 points worse than the second to worst team in the Gamblers. This hurts too. Them being fifth in yards, third in passing isn't the best. It's okay. But when you see that they're worst in rushing at 77 across both seasons, with that being nearly 9 yards worse than the second to worst team in the Panthers that year, yikes. And you can see that with their rushing yards. Cookus was the best in their team, and he didn't even have 300. So if you thought the 22 Bandits were bad, get ready for the 23 Stars. This team was horrid. Their rushing attack was absolutely pitiful. In fact, they didn't even have a 300-yard rusher. Yikes. And the fact that their top three guys combined for 6 fumbles, that hurts too. This may be a bit controversial to have them this low, but I think the fact that their offensive line was so bad for most of the year and they were injured to hell and back. Stribling barely played this year because of injuries. I think it's fair they deserve here. Adam Rodriguez wasn't the same level of dominance he was last year. I think 12 is where they should be. And then at number 11 is the 22 Gamblers. Now, I know some people might think this is a bit high for them. I think this is where they deserve to be. Look, this Gamblers team was really fun for what it was. A team that seemingly blew every halftime lead they had. If I'm not mistaken, they had a halftime lead in, I think, like 9 of the games during the year, and they ended up winning one of them. Or, no, I think they won 2 of them. It was something stupid. Look, they were the only team to beat the 22 Stallions. That team ended up, going literally 11-1 if you count the playoffs. Their only loss was to this team. This team had 3 All-USFL players in Chris Odom, who I still think, aside from Magoo this year, had the best season in the USFL modern history. Will Likely was an unbelievably great corner. And then Donald Payne at linebacker. And you also got to remember this team in Micah Abernathy and Reggie Northrup, 2 other really great defenders. Chris Odom won DPOY, and he had the most sacks in a single season in the modern USFL at an insane 12.5. That's over a sack a game. And he had like 4 block ticks, if I remember correctly. Then turnover differential, they were second. They were second in the turnover differential and takeaways in the 22 season. They had +6 turnover differential, and they had 21 takeaways. Now, they were worst at rushing in the 22 season at 90.1, and they had the worst yards and passing yards across both seasons, with yards being nearly 10 worse than the 23 Maulers and passing yards being just barely worse than the 23 Maulers. So why do I have them this high? I think it's the fact that they did lose a lot of halftime games because really their offense was terrible. This team's defense, while points allowed wise, wasn't the most insane. The amount of turnovers, the amount of sacks, the amount of disruption they caused was insane. Whenever this team won, it was because of their defense, and when they lost, really because of the offense. I get you could say, well, they allowed a last-second score against the Maulers, but if you're saying that, a last-second score to put you up like 22-21 is the defense's fault, I don't buy it. This team, I think, deserves to be this high. I think that when you look back on them, this defense really had a ton of the top spring football talent on it. Donald Payne and Reggie Northrup are literally two of the best linebackers in all of spring football. And the fact they had them on the same roster as Chris Odom, Will Likely, and Abernathy, and a bunch of other guys. Yeah, this was a really dominant defense. Shame their offense was so pitiful. If you combined the offense from the 23 season and the defense from the 22 season, you probably have the best team that's even better than the Stallions. Now, coming in at number 10 as one of the teams to crack the top 10 is the 23 Gamblers. Isn't that ironic? Yeah, the 23 Gamblers, I have him at 10. He finished 5-5. They kind of blew it at the end of the year. They had like a win streak going during the middle of the season, just like the Showboats. It's just like the Showboats as well. They blew it at the end. Look, the Gamblers had 4 all USFL players. They had a running back, a receiver, a tackle, and a safety. Mark Thompson was clearly the standout player. He won Offensive Player of the Year. He had the most rush TDs in a single season among USFL 14. And when you consider the fact he only played 10 games, yeah, just like Chris Odom on defense was this team. It was the exact opposite. This team had like an unbelievably great receiving core, as you can see here. I mean, when Anthony Ratliff Williams is like your 4th best receiver and he was really good this year, that's insane. Now, their issue was defense. They were second to worst at points allowed at 230. They were tied for worst in turnover differential. I apologize, that's supposed to be turnover differential. And then you have the fact that they were 4th in yards, 2nd in rushing, and 5th in passing. Their passing wasn't the best, but the fact that they were still really good at other things is pretty nice. Their turnover differential hurt, but a lot of that was the first couple weeks of the season where Kenji Bahar threw like a metric ton of turnovers and fumbles. So I think this team deserves to be top 10, just barely. I think they are better than the 22 season team, just because while their defense wasn't as good as last year's, it was still better than the offense was last year. Now, coming in at number 9 is going to be the 23 Panthers. Yes, a playoff team gets beat out by a non-playoff team. And I think it's pretty easy to say why. Look, this Michigan Panthers team got so lucky to make the playoffs. Even as a Panthers fan, I gotta admit, this team had no right to be in the playoffs, especially with how good a game they had in the playoffs, with that insane OT game that I'm showing you at the bottom, 31-27. The fact is this team wasn't really that great compared to the other playoff teams. They mainly made it because their defense was much like the 22 Gamblers, except that it was more like a 2-headed monster rather than like a 5-headed monster. Frank Gidna and Breland Speaks were just insane. You could make a case they were the 2 best defensive players in the whole league. Now, I'm not going to make that case, but I will say Gidna was probably the best defensive player in the league. That's why he won Defensive Player of the Year. I mean, he won Defensive Player of the Year. He led the league in tackles for the season at 104. And then Speaks led the league at sacks at 9. Much like the 22 Gamblers did that same thing. And then the team's offense had a lot to be desired. 6th in yards, 7th rushing, 4th in passing. This team was just a really great couple guys on defense and random quarterback play. They had great quarterback play by Josh Love early in the year, and then they had really great play by EJ Perry the last couple weeks of the season. So I'm going to put him here. I think the fact that they did such a good job against the Maulers, who would go on to have a pretty decent showing against the Stallions, helps them out. I think it's pretty safe to say, though, this team really can't be higher than 9. They are clearly the worst team to make the playoffs. So even if you were to say that a playoff team has to be, above a non-playoff team, they're still the worst. Now, coming in at number 8 is going to be the only team to beat a playoff team that missed it, and that's the 23 Showboats. This team was really fun. Look, Jerron Jones made it again, this time as a Showboat. John Atkins made it a DT somehow, and Vinny Papel made it as a special teamer. Derek Dillon won the Special Teams Player of the Year award, and he led the whole league in all-purpose yards at 1108. Then they were one of the 3 teams this year to have a positive turnover differential of +2. And then while stat-wise, like yardage, they were 7th, 6th, and 6th, which isn't the best. This team was able to win by just playing simple football. Look, their point differential being, -23 was totally like an inflated number because they had 2 separate games where they got blown out by like 40. Which, yes, sounds bad, but if you forget those 2 games, you realize, wow, their point differential was really good if you forget the 2 blowouts they had. Because 3 of their losses weren't that bad, and their wins were usually pretty good. They had one really great win streak during the year where they went 5-0 at one point after starting the season 0-3. But at the end, they just couldn't keep it going. Cole Kelly was a very, very solid quarterback. He wasn't the best quarterback, but he was like what people hoped Lynch would be, which is a very solid pocket passing type quarterback who also could run. He just wasn't the best, but he could run. So I think this team deserves to be number 8. They're a very solid team, and I think definitely the best team to miss the playoffs across both seasons. Now, number 7 is going to be the 23 Maulers. Another kind of controversial pick, I would say, but I'm putting them here. Look, the Maulers, they had 5 all-USFL players, a linebacker, a cornerback, a safety, kick returner, and a punt returner. They were 2nd in points allowed in the season at 172. So that was pretty good. And they were only like 2 points off number 1. And then tied for best turnover differential across both seasons at +8. That's tied with the 22 stars. Though they were worst in yards and worst in passing, they weren't the worst. The Gamblers last year helped them out, and then they were fourth in rushing. This team, it's tough. Even though even though the score is a lot, farther apart than it really was against the Stallions in the title game, they still did lose. This team it's just really weird. They won 2 games at the end to make the playoffs. They won the games that mattered. They beat the Panthers in the playoffs in a great OT game. Though they did need help, I don't know. This team's defense was awesome. You brought back, your all USFL safety. Then you ended up gaining a great linebacker. You gained a great cornerback. You got 2 excellent returners. But I feel like 7 is where this team has to be. 4 and 6, I can't really justify putting them above any of the other teams I have above them. And one of those teams that is above them is going to be the 22 Stars. This is the one where hindsight looking back, I think I definitely overrated them a lot in the final power rankings because I remember putting them at number 2. And when I look back, they got lucky against the Generals in a sense that they did play the better game that day, but they should be this low. The Stars finished 6-4. They had 2 all-USFL players, and that was it. They had a kick returner, and they had Channing Stribling, who had the most interceptions in a single season at 7, while only playing in 7 games, by the way. And is 6th in points allowed. That's not good. Then tied for best turnover differential across both seasons is really good at 8. I just mentioned that. They were 5th in yards, 6th in rushing, and 6th in passing. Not so good. Now, they barely did lose the title game in what I think is the best football game in the USFL. I know a lot of you guys said that was the division championship game between the Panthers and Maulers. I think that one was. But why are they this low? I think that when you look at the other teams, they have a lot better talent and better cohesion. This team got hot and got together right when it mattered, and that was the literal last couple of games. Because that, loss at the end of the year, to be fair, was a meaningless game for both teams, the Generals and Stars. We already know they were both going to make it. We already knew they were playing against each other. So it was kind of meaningless. You could argue they really finished 6-3 with a game that didn't matter. But the teams that are above them they're just so much better in certain areas. Cookus was an incredible quarterback, and I think the best quarterback of the season. He got kind of screwed over for all USFL. But even then, I look at that team and I look back, I don't think they were as good as the teams above them. I have them at 6. Now, coming at number 5 is going to be one of the 2 franchises that has a top 5 team from both years, and this is the 22 Breakers. This was a good team. I think I look back on it, and I did look back on it as a worse team than they are, and then when I looked back on it for this video, I realized this team was pretty good. Look, they had 6 all-USFL players. I did not remember them having this many. Slaughter made it, Canella made it, they had a center, Davin Bellamy, they had a DT, and they had a linebacker. Really good team. Jordan Ellis led the league in rushing yards at 596. They had the best points allowed across both seasons at an insane 148. That means they gave up less than 15 points a game. They were 4th in yards, 4th in rushing, and 3rd in passing. Now, I do think the Slaughterhouse was across both seasons in the XFL the single most overrated quarterback. I think that the amount of turnovers he had was insane, and he was not as good as some people tried to make him out to be. He was still a solid quarterback. But when you consider the fact this team had a great receiver as well, they had an insane tight end, they had a good offensive line, they had a great defense. Yeah, this team was really good. And I look back at that, I mentioned it during my, playoff game tier list. I looked back at that game against the Stallions as them getting blown out the whole game, not that they got blown out in the second half. So I think that when you look back, this team looks a lot better in, from now to last year, especially with how the 23 season ended up going. This is a really great team. I think they deserve to be number 5. They were a very solid team. Great team. Now, number 4 is going to be the 22 Generals. Another one of the kind of hot takes I have, but because I think some people might think this team should be higher, I'm putting them at 4. They went 9-1. Then they lost their one playoff game. They lost the first game. They still have the longest win streak across either season at 9. Really good. They had 7 all-USFL players. Darius Victor made it. Devontae Turpin made it twice. They had 2 offensive linemen. They had a DT. They had a safety. Great team. Mike Raleigh won Coach of the Year. Darius Victor won Offensive Player of the Year. Devontae Turpin won MVP. Victor had 9 rushing TDs that led the league. Turpin had 540 receiving yards. That led the league. Most yards across both seasons at 349.4, which is nearly 17 higher than the 23 Stallions, second best. Most rushing yards across both seasons at 160.6, an insane 26.4 better than the 23 Generals, next best team, and they were second in passing yards. They were great until the playoffs came where they kind of just got outplayed the whole game. This team was really good offensively. You had a two-headed monster at both quarterback and running back. DeAndre Johnson and Elise Perez at quarterback, Trey Williams and Darius Victor at running back. Cavante Turpin was that X factor that allowed the whole thing to work seamlessly, and we saw that without him, the team suffered immensely. And then their defense, that's why they're this low. I think that their defense wasn't good enough to put them high, and in the end, Mike Riley's coaching and injuries ended up costing them. Having just Elise Perez in that playoff game hurt, and they finally got exposed when a team played them a third time, but mainly a team played them back-to-back. I think that 4 is where they belong. I don't think this team would have beat the 3 teams above them, and one of those 3 teams above them is the 23 Breakers. The 23 Breakers I have as the third best team. I still stand by the fact that Wes Hills for like the last few games was really not that good. But in the beginning of the year, oh my God, he was a monster. 679 rushing yards, the most across either season. The team only had 2 All-USFL players in Wes Hills and Paul Adams, but a lot of that was because a guy like MBT was a really great quarterback, would have easily been All-USFL the year prior, but Alex Magoo existed. Vontae Diggs, incredibly great linebacker on this team, but there were 3 guys that were better than him that just had insane seasons. So this team had a lot of great players that didn't make the All-USFL team because where they were great, other teams also had great players, but this team had like almost everywhere. They had a great tight end, Sage Surratt. He only didn't get it because Jay Sternberger existed. See what I mean? Matt Conklin had a great year, but Luis Aguilar existed. This team was like full of second best players, which is why they were so good. MBT had the most yards in a single season across both years at 24.33. They led the league in points allowed at 170, second best turnover differential at +3, second in yards, fifth in rushing, and the most passing yards across either season, being 34 yards better than the 22 Panthers. This team was really, really good. They really were. The biggest issue was the lack of, I would say, a backup running back. When you have the guy that has the most yards, but you finish fifth in rushing, something didn't happen. They didn't have a dual threat quarterback. They didn't have the best of backup running backs. I mean, that's all I can really complain about. And the fact that they did get absolutely hammered in the playoff game. But I think this team was overall a really great team. I think they deserve to be third. I think that both Breakers teams were really good and could have definitely been in the title game if it hadn't been for the fact that the top 2 teams in this list are both teams that beat them. And the team coming in number 2 is the 22 Stallions. Put in the first version at second. Finished 9-1. Only lost a meaningless game in week 9. They had 5 All-USFL players, though 2 of those spots were just Victor Bolton. They were the second best team at points allowed across both seasons at 161. Third in yards, second in rushing, fourth in passing. They beat the Breakers in a pretty decent game, and they ended up barely beating the Stars. Putting them at 2, just because I think the 23 team was better. Look, DeMarcus Gates was incredible at linebacker. Victor Bolton was incredible himself. But the 23 team, let's just go into it. This 23 team was so damn good. They may have gone 8-2. They may have gone technically, 10-2, which is the worst record. But those 2 losses were very early in the year. They were 3-2. And then they went on and they just kept winning. And when you consider the fact that they played in a better division this year than they did last year, the Showboats and Gamblers are both better this year than last year's Gamblers and Bandits. The Breakers are better than last year's Breakers. And most of the North was better than last year's North, minus the Generals. And they still finished 8-2 is incredible. Look, they had 4 All-USFL players, which sounds less. But Alex Magoo, by far the best quarterback in the league. Jay Sternberger, easily the best, if not second best tight end in the league. Their punter ended up winning the punter All-USFL. They had the long snapper as well. But the main thing is Alex Magoo led the league in completion percentage, pass TDs, yards per pass, and passer rating. They were still great defensively, third in points allowed at 190. First in yards, second in passing, third in rushing. Magoo in the playoffs, otherworldly. 552 across 2 games, 69.6 completion percentage, zero point 0.1 under a 10 yards per pass, 8 TDs to 0 picks, 3 sacks taken, and a 140 pass rating. And that's not even including his great ground game he had. I think this team was better than the 22 team. Look, I know at the end, the 22 team had Jamar at his peak. It had Bo Scarborough, had Marlon Williams, and had DeMarcus Gates. But this team, I think the 23 team was just better overall. Because even though they didn't have the name brand, the guys just seemingly played better. Their running backs played exceptional through the second half of the season. Their receiving core played exceptional through the second half of the season. They dealt with injuries very early on. This wasn't, guys came mid-season. This team that won the title was basically assembled in like week 3 when Bo, Jamar, and Marlon were all out. And they continued to just be dominant. I think they were the best team across both seasons. I think they were the best team across spring football we have seen since the AAF's inception. So, that'll do it. This has been Zom Fox. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to like and subscribe to the video. This is a long video. This is a great one, I think. Let me know down below what you guys think your rankings are. Do you disagree or agree with mine? And why? And as always, have a great night.